Hello. No, this is not a butterfly net. I rarely catch butterflies with it. This is an insect net. And most of the insects that I prefer to capture for study are in the order Diptera, the true flies. My dear mother would certainly be horrified by me chasing after such vermin, as she would have called them. I can still recall her screams, "Phineas, come quick! Get this hideous beast out of here!" Of course, the task would then fall upon me to remove the offending insect or spider from our home. Although I did grow up with a fondness for nature and the out of doors, thanks to Mother's phobias, I too was somewhat uneasy around insects throughout my childhood. Luckily, I had the good fortune of other influences that would change my opinion of these marvelous creatures. It was about 25 years ago, 1860, I believe. As a young student in Washington, D.C., I was introduced to the Baron von Ostensacken, a Russian diplomat by vocation, an eminent entomologist by avocation. Very dignified gentleman he was, never without his top hat. I just assumed that to be part of his dapper attire, but such was not the entire truth. Together, we would explore the grounds of the Smithsonian, collecting insect specimens. But the Baron was rarely seen with an insect net like this. Now, I can still envision the way he would use forceps to dexterously grasp the flies right off the blossoms. Off came his hat, and there inside were pins on a small piece of corkboard on which he would impale his newly collected prize, saving it for later study. The Baron's enthusiastic mentoring in large part led to my current appreciation for these marvelous animals. Natural history, especially the study of insects, became my vocation. And so it is as a naturalist, I find that every organism, from the tallest trees to the smallest insects, have many stories to tell. For example, let's examine this beetle. It's a fine specimen of the Great Plains Darkling beetle, Eleodes suturalis. We could talk about its life history. It spends much of its life as a worm-like larva underground. We can look at its place in nature's order, the habitat that it lives in, what it eats, what eats it. We might discuss the various adaptations that help this insect to survive in a world full of danger and competition. For example, notice how it lifts its abdomen when disturbed. These are the skunks of the insect world. And most would-be predators are deterred by the unpleasant odor that just sprayed forth from its abdomen. But in the case of this fascinating beetle, I would suggest that the most interesting story that it has to tell is that of its discovery in 1819 by none other than the father of American entomology, Thomas Say. For it was in that year that the United States Topographical Engineers mapping expedition departed from Pittsburgh, led by Major Stephen Long. That enterprising and excellent officer invited Mr. Say and fellow Philadelphian, the naturalist and artist Titian Peale, to accompany them on their journey. The mission was to ascend the Missouri River to Council Bluffs. From there, they would map the Platte River to its origins in the Rocky Mountains of what is now Colorado. Such an adventure, for there was no greater thrill for Mr. Say and Mr. Peale than to be out in the field collecting specimens and discovering species new to science. Of course, they would first want to learn what was already known of the region. Why not study the reports and journals from the glorious Corps of Discovery expedition led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Those explorers passed through a portion of this region en route to the Pacific Ocean in 1804. A map would be helpful, and to their delight, Major Long was able to obtain copies of the maps created by their predecessors. Of course, in 1819, they didn't have the modern conveniences that we have today in 1885. There were no railroads, no wagon trails, nor stagecoach routes in the West at that time. The rivers were the roads. And so it was initially all Mr. Say and Mr. Peel could do on most days was to cling to the railings of the steamship Western Engineer, watching as vast portions of unexplored territory passed by on shore as they ascended the Missouri River. In early August, they arrived at Fort Osage in western Missouri, and it was there that Major Long gave the naturalists the opportunity to separate from the main group on the river and travel a portion of the route on land. It was on land that the discovery of new species would be guaranteed. The party of 13 was provisioned with 3 pack horses for the transportation of their equipment and baggage. Major Long gave their command to Mr. Say, who was to lead the party. Travel overland, crossing the Kansas River at the Kansas village. Thence, traverse the country by nearest route to the Platte River, descending the Platte back to its confluence with the Missouri River, where you'll once again meet up with the steamboat. On the afternoon of August 6th, they departed from Fort Osage. Traveling by foot, Lewis and Clark's maps in hand, they set out across the prairie. Such a thrilling hunt it was, collecting birds, netting insects, bagging snakes along the way. Now, this sort of travel was not easy. These young Pennsylvanians were no strangers to summer heat and humidity. But here in the region we now refer to as eastern Kansas, there are few trees for shade. A little relief from the midday sun. They marched for miles each day, constantly exposed to the elements, causing great fatigue. Many of the men began to suffer from impaired health and even dysentery. The tall, coarse grasses that covered the plains greatly impeded their travel, rapidly destroying their clothing. At times they were swarmed by large numbers of flies that would lay eggs on their provisions and even on their clothing. I imagine the conversation thus: "Mr. Peel, I do believe this blowfly to be a new species." "Indeed, Mr. Say, however, I cannot tell if we are collecting them or they're attempting to collect us." On the evening of August 13th, they finally arrived along the banks of the Kansas River, having traveled parallel to its course for much of the past week. Recall that they were guided primarily by maps that were more than 15 years old, from which they attempted to identify the various tributaries of the river as they crossed them. Unfortunately, Clark's map makers only depicted the larger streams, making it impossible to identify the various creeks that they passed with, matching them up with those shown on the map. Hence, they were lost. Is the Kansas village now upstream into the west or downstream into the east? They decided to camp on that very spot and send the healthier members out in all directions in search of the Kansas village. By the 19th of August, they finally found the Kansas village. It was upstream and to the west of their camp, but by then most of the men were quite ill, and the others suffering from exhaustion and hunger. They were uncertain as to how they would be received by the Kansas, in part due to some recent unpleasant encounters between some soldiers and a Kansas hunting party. They decided to proceed with caution, arms at the ready in case of trouble. They approached the village, and suddenly the chiefs and warriors came rushing out on horseback, painted and decorated, followed by great numbers on foot. To their relief, Mr. Say and his men were received with the utmost cordiality and immediately conducted into the village by the chiefs who went before them and on each side to protect them from the encroachments of the curious crowd. They were escorted into the largest lodge of the village, that of the principal chief, Kahige Watainga. The crowd followed them in to densely fill the spacious room. Mr. Say and his men were seated on the beds directly across from the entrance to the lodge, still protected from the pressure of the crowd by the chiefs who took their seats on the ground immediately in front of them. To their delight, an interpreter, Charbonneau, happened to be visiting the village at the time, working on behalf of the U.S. government's Indian Agency. This was indeed the very same French-Canadian trader Toussaint Charbonneau, who with his Shoshone wife Sacagawea had served as interpreters and guides on the glorious Corps of Discovery expedition with Lewis and Clark just 15 years earlier. They smoked a pipe and were offered a variety of foods presented to them by the chiefs. Although not feeling at all well, Mr. Say was representing the United States government on behalf of Major Long. Through the interpreter Charbonneau, he explained their peaceful intentions in passing through the Kansas territory. They truly did come in peace to explore the expansive prairies. Their arms and equipment were displayed in front of them to be examined by the assembled crowd. The exhausted explorers, no doubt, must have been quite uncomfortable, as they were unfamiliar with the customs and mannerisms of their hosts. Suddenly, a beetle, much like this one, scampered forth toward Mr. Say from the feet of the crowd. This was a species he was not familiar with, and suspected that it must be new to science. Of course, the beetle would not be unfamiliar to the Kansas, who certainly would have been well aware of the unpleasant odor that this insect would produce in its defense if disturbed. Undeterred by his illness and fatigue, and momentarily unaware of his unfamiliar surroundings, Mr. Say couldn't help himself and lunged at his prize, collecting the first specimen of this species ever seen by an Eastern man of science. All eyes were instantly on Mr. Say, as an uneasy silence fell upon the crowd, their conversations completely interrupted mid-sentence. Undoubtedly, the Kansas must have been shocked by such a breach of decorum, by this easily distracted young naturalist. Due to his unusual displays of scientific curiosity, they conferred upon Mr. Say the respectful and somewhat mystic title of Wakandagi, a medicine man. Had the Kansa nation lacked such civility and hospitality, it could have meant the end of the expedition for these gentlemen. This would be the first of many specimens of this species that the naturalists would encounter on their journey across the prairie and to the foot of the Rocky Mountains. And this species, only one of hundreds of plants and animals described for the very first time by Thomas Say and Tyson Peel during the expedition of Major Stephen Long. I've traveled this region extensively and can assure you that these explorers would not recognize the place today. Gone is the Kansa village, replaced by the modern city of Manhattan, Kansas, in the state that still bears the name of the once populous Kansa nation. The remaining members of the tribe, known as the Kaw people, were relocated to Oklahoma in 1872. Barely 500 of their numbers still alive at that time. And yet, even today, on a warm summer evening, you can walk down most any country road just outside of town, and you just might encounter, as I have on many occasions, a fine specimen or two of the Great Plains Darkling beetle.